7 hours and 37 minutes on January 6th. That is the time gap in former President Trump's call logs from the day of the U.S. Capitol attack. This according to documents given to the January 6th committee and obtained by the Washington Post. We should note CNN first reported a significant gap in these presidential call records back in February. Sources also tell the Post the committee is now investigating whether Trump communicated that day instead through back channels, potentially using phones that belong to aides or even burner phones. CNN law enforcement correspondent Whitney Wild, she's been following the story for us. Whitney, this is an incredible gap, hours on an incredible day that seems to violate presidential record laws here. What do we know?
Well, Jim, the committee's trying to figure out if they got everything because, as you point out, the gaps are just so obvious. The last call is recorded at 11:17, and it's to an unidentified person, extremely vague. The next call recorded occurred at 6:54 p.m. to Dan Scavino. It has been widely reported that Trump did speak to lawmakers that day as this riot unfolded. Among them, Senators Mike Lee, Tommy Tuberville, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Another major call missing from this log is his last call with former Vice President Mike Pence, in which he is accused of trying once again this last-ditch effort to try to pressure Pence to overturn the election results. And during that call, Pence said finally it just could not be done. He would not do it. According to the Washington Post, there are logs of Trump speaking with top allies such as Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani prior to the riot, attempting to contact Senators David Perdue, Mitch McConnell, and Josh Hawley prior to the riot. After the attack, he's shown speaking with White House counsel Pat Cipollone, campaign advisor Jason Miller, White House press secretary Kayleigh McEnany. Jim, this comes on the heels of an explosive court ruling yesterday in which a judge in California said plainly it is more likely than not that the former president did commit a crime when he tried to overturn the election. So certainly a lot of questions going on. The main questions, Jim, where are those call logs? Why were they not recorded? Yeah,
it's a good point, too. So someone, Cheney, who was senior in Republican leadership, accusing the president of possibly committing a crime. Whitney Wild, thanks so much. Here with me to discuss, former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. Good to have you on, Renato. I believe there are laws governing records for presidential phone calls. To have a 7-hour gap, does that indicate to you evidence that laws were broken here?
Well, it may reveal more than that, Jim, if, for example, there were other phones being used surreptitiously that were not only not being recorded and not being provided, but actually were being used for the purpose of hiding activity or communications. We do know that some of the other folks around the former president were using what's called burner phones. They were using phones that you would toss away. So that, I mean, it certainly raises a lot of questions. And I think what is going to be an important step for the committee is to make sure that they are able to talk to folks that were close to former President Trump and see if there are witnesses that recall seeing him on the phone during that period of time.
Wouldn't using a burner phone signify intent? You and I have talked about, at every level of this investigation, right, the importance of intent, whether that be intent to interfere in the election or intent to avoid records of communications. From a legal perspective, would that indicate intent?
It certainly shows a intent to hide your activity. It is the sort of activity that is heavily associated with not only criminal activity, but knowing criminal activity. I used to get wiretaps on phones when I was a federal prosecutor, and the folks that use burner phones were usually drug dealers, people who were involved in a drug cartel in some way, who knew that they had to toss their phone every 30 days to try to stymie the efforts of people like myself and law enforcement. So I think it would certainly be astounding if something like that happened. And I think the explanation for the Trump camp has to be that he was off the phone for 7 hours straight. And really what investigators are going to need to establish is, first of all, was he the sort of person who could stay off the phone for 7 hours? And on that day, can they establish through other evidence that he was on the phone? And if so, where are the records? It reminds me of the Nixon gap, but a much larger one.
Well, just quickly before we go, Where's the DOJ on this? This is, to this point, it's a January 6th committee. That's a political process. They will come up with a report that may be potentially damning. But in terms of criminal prosecution or referrals, where does the DOJ stand on this?
We don't know for sure. The fact that the committee was jumping up and down yesterday, asking Merrick Garland and the Justice Department to act, suggests that they're not working hand in glove with the DOJ, which had been one possibility. And so either the Justice Department is waiting for this investigation to wrap up, which would be unusual in my view, and frankly concerning, because that would mean that potentially evidence could get stale or leads could get lost while they're waiting for this committee to wrap up. Or potentially Justice Department really does not believe that, based on what they've seen, that there's a sufficient predicate for an investigation, which I think would be surprising. And I do think the public has a right to know whether or not an investigation is being undertaken of these activities.
No question. And throughout all this, the question, what rises to the level of punishable behavior here hasn't yet. Renato Mariotti, thanks very much.